meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. Ask everybody to please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Chair West.
Yes.
Director Mobley.
Here.
Director Perello.
Here.
Director Terry.
Here. All right, with that, we will recess the general meeting, go into closed session until 1:30. Who are we? We're missing Bert. Where did Bert go? All right, good afternoon, everyone. We will resume the February 26, 2020 meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. We have returned from closed session to report that there was no action taken in closed session that requires a reporting here. Moving on, though, with the regular agenda review, any changes to the agenda?
No changes, Chair.
Thank you. Public, this is an opportunity now for public comments. Anyone wishing to address the board on matters not otherwise on today's agenda, please feel free to come forward and do so. Seeing none, we'll move on to board member comments. Any comments by the board? Will? Bert? No? Mike? All right, let's move on then to the consent agenda. There are 2 items on the consent agenda. Unless anyone has any questions or wishes to remove one of those items, the chair will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Move for approval.
Second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor? All right. Let's move on then to the regular agenda, item number 6.
Chair West, Directors, Glenn Shepherd, GMA staff. Before you is a resolution and appreciation for Director Charlotte Craven and her departure, celebrating 21 years of service to the board, 6-term director and 3-term alternate director. With her absence, we'll forego reading the entire resolution, but before you is a resolution for approval. And her desire was to have it presented at a future City of Camarillo City Council meeting, and we will schedule that.
It certainly
Should be
seems that
approved.
after 21 years is the least we could possibly do. Any questions or comments from the public or the board? Hearing, is there a motion to adopt the resolution? And a second?
Second.
And I guess we need a roll call because it's a resolution.
Chair West.
Yes.
Director Bennett.
Yes.
Director Mobley.
Yes.
Director Perello.
Yes.
Director Terry.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Moving on then to item number 7, the John K. Flynn Groundwater Stewardship Award.
Chair West, Directors, Glenn Shepherd, GMA staff. Again, this is the annual John Flynn Groundwater Stewardship Award, and the request here is to have your board appoint a 2-person ad hoc committee to, one, participate in the call for nominations and select this year's award winner.
Okay, this is for those of you who haven't participated, this is a fairly simple process. The nominations are collected, and usually the recipient is selected, or the recipient recommended by the ad hoc over the phone. We don't usually need to convene special meetings for that, so it's a fairly simple process. Any volunteers among members of the board to be on that committee? Mike? All right. Steve? How about you? You have time?
No.
Will you volunteer then? Okay, no, thank you. All right, let's move on then to, I'm gonna put my glasses on. Item number 8.
Chair West, board members, for the record, Jeff Pratt. I'm going to give you just a brief presentation of the item, then I'm going to ask Gina Bartlett, who's mentioned to step up and answer any detailed questions you might have. What you have before you is a request to consider 3 different contracts for facilitation support services, which will be paid for by DWR and the mediator provided by DWR. The idea came to us from a group of stakeholders in the Oxnard Plain. Originally, they wanted to share the cost of a facilitator, but when we found out that DWR was willing to do that for us, we put together the scopes of work that you see. The scopes of work are relatively flexible. It's hard to know exactly what they'll be facilitating now, but Gina can help you walk through the process, and I'd ask her to the podium right now if she doesn't mind.
Good afternoon. Do you want me to just go ahead and start?
Go ahead, start.
Great. It's nice to meet you all. My name is Gina Bartlett, and I'm a senior facilitator with the Consensus Building Institute. And I've been working on groundwater throughout California since around 2005 or 2007. The scope of work that's been provided through the Department of Water Resources will kind of follow the direction you all are headed to form advisory committees. And what we will be able to do is conduct stakeholder interviews so that you're at a good midway point where you've approved your GSPs, your groundwater sustainability plans. And so we will do some outreach and talk to your stakeholders, interview them about the path forward, how they would like to be able to engage and contribute on implementing the groundwater sustainability plans. And then we would be able to provide services to mediate or facilitate those committees in all 3 basins. I think just a couple more comments, and then I'll open it up for any questions you might have. We do function quite independently. We are impartial facilitators, and by that I mean that we don't have a stake or shape on the substance of any recommendations that would come back to you out of the advisory committees, but we do work really carefully with staff and all of the stakeholders to move them through the process into the outcomes and goals that they set for themselves. So I think with that, unless there's something else you want me to mention in particular, Jeff, I just open it up for questions.
No, that was great, Gina. I would add one thing. Gina, when the original group of stakeholders came in, so Gina was one of 2 that they asked us to look at, and the other one was out of state. So Gina is actually their suggestion. I thought that might be important for your board to know. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gina.
Yeah, sure.
How long a process is this anticipated to be, and what sort of time commitments will be necessary?
So that is to be determined. What I would recommend is that we do the stakeholder assessment. I mean, in meeting with your staff, I understand that the goal of the advisory committees is for groundwater sustainability plan implementation. So when we do the round of interviews with your stakeholders, what we would do is outline the key issues that they think should be prioritized for consideration and discussion with regard to implementing the plans. And then we would develop a work plan that would outline the duration and the topics and sequence of discussions. And then I think at that point, we would work with the staff and brief all of you for any other further direction you want to provide with regard to timeline or conversations and topics that are under consideration.
With respect to the evolution of the facilitation plan, it was not, at least it's my recollection, it was not a product of adopting the GSP, and it wasn't directed toward implementation of the GSP. It grew out of the adoption of an allocation plan, and I think those were the issues that the stakeholders who raised the idea and that the board that agreed were interested in seeing, and I guess where most of the discussion would be conducted.
Okay, that's great.
I don't care what else is discussed as long as that's a priority.
Absolutely. That's very helpful, and we can focus right in on that, because I know that that's an important topic for many of your stakeholders and you as a board.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board?
So Gina, looking at the level of effort.
And Las Posas, but how did you come up with those numbers? I see there's quite a bit of difference, like Las Posas has quite a few more hours. How do you divide up their time?
So my understanding is that the thinking behind this is that because Oxnard and Pleasant Valley often coalesce and meet together, that those hours in a sense are combined. And then the Las Posas would be its own set of hours, and that's why it has more allocated than Oxnard on its own or Pleasant Valley on its own.
And maybe I can add a little bit more to that, Director Mobley. So when we contacted DWR, it was their intent at the onset of these things, because they're going to be doing it around the state, to try to sprinkle the money evenly.
Yeah.
And we didn't know what level of work there was going to be. We had to we knew that there was enough, that the work will never be done. We can always use a facilitator. Let me put it that way. But we needed to step into the shallow end of the pool to figure out further what might be required. So we'll be able to go back to DWR for budget requests if we need to. But they basically it comes from this idea that their initial allocations to all of the groundwater basins are going to look similar.
Yeah, I would concur. That's a great way to characterize it.
Thank you, Gina. Any other questions from the board? Nobody ask any. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the public with respect to this item?
Chairman West, Directors of the Board, my name is Alden Broom with Broom Ranches. Just a comment, not a question. Just want to commend the GMA staff for taking the lead in applying for the grant with DWR and obtaining the services of Mrs. Bartlett. As a stakeholder in the OPV basin, we look forward to working with her on some of the outstanding issues that were developed, related to both the GSP and the allocation ordinance. And so we look forward to the process, and we hope we can reach agreements that are broadly supported during it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alden. Anyone else? All right, this is no action required on this item. If there's nothing further, let's move on then to item number 9.
Good afternoon, Chair West and members of the board. For the record, I am Kim Loeb, staff to the GMA. And this item is a discussion and request for direction on allocation variance request processing and developing of penalties for non-report extractions for implementing the new allocation ordinance in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins, and also ultimately in the other basins as we get new allocation systems. So your board, adopted that new allocation system for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins in October of last year. The initial allocations are assigned to wells based on the average annual extractions reported from 2005 through 2014, the base period, with the new allocation system becoming fully effective on October 1st of this year. And at that meeting also, your board directed that we move forward with developing new allocation systems for the Las Posas Valley Basin, as well as the Arroyo Santa Rosa Valley Basin, to fully move off of Ordinance E and the irrigation allowance allocations starting in October. Before we get into this item, I think it is worth stepping back and looking at how variances were considered or conceived in the ordinance. And this is consistent with other ordinances and the agency ordinance code in general, in terms of what is the purpose and standard of variance. And the purpose, the main reason is to enable an owner-operator make use of groundwater in the same manner as other users in the basin. And before variance can be granted, the applicant, owner-operator must make sure that, must establish, and we must make sure that the following standards are met, that there's special or exceptional characteristics of that applicant in that situation that aren't generally applicable to others in the basin. The granting of the variance won't grant a special privilege on that applicant. That denial of the variance would result in practical or hardship, unnecessary hardships to that applicant. That the granting of the variance would not be inconsistent with SGMA and implementation of the groundwater sustainability plan or the agency's ability to achieve sustainable management. So that's the overriding purpose that was in the ordinance that your board adopted, and again, consistent with variance process in other ordinance in the ordinance code in general. So we anticipate that there will be a significant number of variance requests for initial allocation extraction determination. Agency will shortly be sending letters to all operators and owners in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins, giving them a list of the extractions that were reported to the agency and we have in our database for the 20 semi-annual extraction periods over that 10-year period, and then what the initial allocation would be to that extraction facility or well under the new ordinance. We anticipate the routine types of variances will be, for instance, the land was fallowed for a year or more during that time because our operator owner was switching to an organic operation. Maybe one well is missing extractions, but it was replaced by another well, and those need to be put together. Maybe a well was down for a period of that time, and so the extractions are not representative of what was past and future extractions. Those are the typical kinds of variances anticipated. But additionally, we do expect that we will receive through the variance process requests from owners and operators who have unreported extractions during that base period. And so it's an average over the 10 years, and so if someone is missing 2 years of extraction on their well, that's a 20% reduction in allocation if under a 10-year average annual extraction. But if it's because the extractions were unreported, that's not actually technically a variance request. It's really addressing a violation of the agency ordinance code for not reporting. The ordinance code and GMA's enabling legislation allow for establishment of a civil penalty up to $1,000 a day for any violation of the ordinance code. Your board adopted a resolution 2019-1, which was an updating of 2013-1, which established a penalty of $50 a day for a number of penalties, including failure to report extractions. However, even at $50 a day, for a period could be as long as 15 years, that could be a fairly extravagant and potentially unreasonable penalty. So our purpose, what your board's heard some of this before, and direct us to go to the executive committee to work through these details, which we did, and the executive committee met on 3 occasions in July and October, and then earlier this month to work through the details of variance processing, and then an expedited process recommendation for those requests that result from unreported extractions during that 2005 to 2014 base period. And what the executive committee recommended is that in that 10 years, if there's 5 or more, in other words, the majority of the extractions are reported, then there could be an expedited process where the pumping fees plus interest for the unreported extractions need to be paid. There would be a civil penalty due for the violation of not filing those semi-annual statements. And we worked through and recommended a tiered penalty where the penalties for a well that was extracting much less groundwater would pay a lower penalty than those owners and operators that are extracting significant amount more. And then the allocation could be determined based on the average of the reported years. And again, this is the majority of the years were reported. So here is a recommended schedule of what those civil penalties would be for these operators and owners who had reported 5 or more years. And what we're looking at here is the number of periods not reported. So it's semi-annual, so it could be up to 10 years not reported. And then there are 6 tiers: 0 to 5 acre feet, 5 to 15, 15 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, and more than 100. And then the amounts here is what the civil penalty would be for these various tiers of pumping and the number of periods not reported. So for 0 to 5, missing 1 period, that'd be a $1,500 penalty, all the way up to a $91,250 penalty for non-reporting. This column here shows what it would be $50 a day. through this process. And the executive committee recommended that those civil penalties be used for the benefit of the basin. Staff recommends collecting the civil penalties that are collected during that variance processing be held in a designated account similar to what we do with the surcharges now, and that we would track our time and expenses for processing all the variances, and then if there was additional costs for the variance processing above what the application fee was, then we would request to transfer that to the operating account from that civil penalty reserve account. And then the balance of the penalties collected, which would be probably the larger share, would remain designated for your board's direction for any future use. So that concludes my review of the variance processing and civil penalties for the unreported extractions that we expect to be receiving through a variance process. And I've just kind of summed up or listed out the various pieces of that. The initial extraction for wells with unreported extractions. There'd be this expedited process for wells with 5 or fewer years unreported. In other words, the majority of the 10 years was reported with tiered civil penalties. We talked about this issue of extenuating circumstances. What is an innocent landowner? Is that something that should be considered? And what would be the criteria and penalties? And maybe it's a case by case, I don't know. Then the variance request for the new or additional extraction allocation we just talked about. We're recommending your board consider a stakeholder variance review committee, and the application fee, the use of the civil penalty fees, and then any other recommendations that your board may have regarding moving forward with processing of variances. So based on what your board directs to us, we will develop a resolution for implementing the process and penalties and come to your board in a future meeting for your board's consideration.
All right. I guess before we dive into it, why don't we see if we have any questions or comments from the public? Thank you, Kim. Anyone?
Good afternoon, Board. Rob Saperstein. I apologize, and I didn't have a chance to participate in the executive committee development of the chart. And this is a more generic concern, caution, how quickly the dollars grow. If you're looking at a greater than 100 acre foot per year parcel, that really for an agricultural user, that equates to maybe at best 40 acre parcel. So you're probably talking 10 times that amount for, if there is such a thing as a typical agricultural user. So you're talking real money. And what you're proposing to do is to go back, in some circumstances, more than 15 years to impose a penalty for underreporting, maybe in some circumstances, non-reporting. It's frightening. I mean, statute of limitations for fraud is 6-7 years. And you're proposing potentially going back 15 years in some circumstances. My worry is less about any particular folks I represent than real money is the potential for a trigger for an adjudication. And what a bizarre trigger to motivate somebody to need to file a water rights type piece of litigation because of penalties for failing to file for 2, 3, 4 years. The trouble is, I don't have a good answer for you. What's the alternative? You certainly don't want to reward bad behavior. Everybody sitting in this audience here are largely among those folks that have been participating and wanting this to work, but we want it to work. We don't want GMA staff to have their time absorbed through what I don't have a sense of how many folks might be in the queue for some portion of, again, going back 2005 to 2014. It's a while ago. And that's the base period to establish folks' future behavior, and the implications for their water rights are huge. So I don't want to overstate it. I don't have a good sense of what the problem is. This has the potential to consume an inordinate amount of staff time and resources, and I'm just not sure where the teeter point is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Anyone else? All right, Kim, let's go through this list. Questions or comments?
I have a comment. Number one, I appreciate the executive committee working through this. And that's why you need a committee, because it's when it gets this detailed and stuff. Two, my understanding is these are up to, this is the maximum we could find, but we could always assess a penalty less than that, correct?
So, Director Bennett, the purpose of this is for an expedited processing and actually to reduce staff time, not to increase it. And so, as you can see, and again, one important thing I should emphasize is we're not proposing it. We're going to go back and look and go try to collect these from people. This is when owners or operators come to us and say, for a variance application, they say, well, your initial allocation for moving forward, there's missing years that we didn't report, and so we're getting shorted on our allocation because there's actual pumping. And so this is an expedited process to provide them the ability to have that allocation, but others were fully in compliance with the ordinance code and through this time. And so that was really the balance that the executive committee was trying to establish. And frankly, in hours and hours of stakeholder meetings that Jeff and I attended, it was one of those themes. We know they're lurking out there is this issue, and there needs to be some balance that these folks need to be penalized because those who were playing by the rules should not be disadvantaged by those who were not. And so just applying your board's resolution of $50 a day, you can see it's significantly more. Now,
Well, Kim, the question was, we collect up to that, or we collect that amount?
the idea was that we would collect this amount for those who had more than 5 years of reporting.
Okay, thank you. That was my first question. So I appreciate that the executive committee wrestled with and came up with an adjusted formula based on the amount of water. I think we've always said that in here, and that is the people that aren't playing by the rules are the ones that need to pay, so that everybody else is out there in terms of doing that. So rather than going through all of them one by one, I am fine with the recommendations, except the one place that I would, I raise as a question, I'm not sure that I feel strongly on, is the creation of a variance review committee. I think in general, I'm looking for staff to give us their professional opinion and then have it come to us. So I would support this with that modification. I would support with where you're going. But I do have one other question, and that is on page 2 of 5 of the report, and this is the identification that says staff expects the other new ordinances will include similar language. So this is Article 2. Under 11.7, it says, for the water year beginning October 1, 2020, variances may be applied for by June 30th, 2020. And I just that says may be applied for by June 20th. What if they don't apply by June 20th? Does that mean they cannot apply? Not sure the language is clear. So they must be, variances must be applied for by June 20 for that time period?
So,
Can you help me with that?
Director Bennett, and the idea there is that October 1st is when the new ordinance is in effect, and the idea is to have the applications in. We expect some of these may take some time to process, so that they can be processed and the owners and operators can know what their allocation is by the time that it starts on October 1st. And then you'll see that variances for later years would be accepted through June 30th of the following year for variance that might go in effect of the October 1st of the following year. Certainly that's something that your board could extend if it needed to be extended, but that's how the ordinance was written as adopted.
So again, my question is, so it's June 30th, 2020, and coming up October 20th is when the water year is going to begin. Right. So I have to apply by June 30th for the variance, or I may apply by June 30th?
May apply by June 30th if you want to have your variance considered and become effective in October 1st of 2020.
So why don't we say must apply by June 30th if we wanted to apply for October 1st? I guess maybe it's a council question.
Yes, and I understand the point of the question. It is meant to be a deadline. I think the reason it was phrased in permissive language rather than using the word shall was that it's an option to the pumper to apply for the variance, but the intent certainly is that be a deadline.
Well, I guess I would just, because right now, if I didn't apply by June 30th, I'd look at this language and say, yeah, sure, I could have, but didn't say I had to by then. So I just want clarity for everybody that's going to be dealing with this. So that'd be my recommendation in terms of that. And we have the same language in the next sentence, may be applied for by, in the next sentence of that. So those are my thoughts on this presentation. Thank you.
With respect to the stakeholder variance review, I think at least my understanding, and I may misunderstood, Kim, you tell me, but my understanding of the thought from the executive committee was that that would be appropriate for the other variance requests that were covered on one of the slides. Those types of variance requests that specifically affected everyone, the stakeholders' direct allocations. With respect to the typical variance request or the request with respect to missed reporting periods, that really wasn't what we intended.
Okay, that's fine. Great. Okay, with that understanding, I'm fine with that then.
The stickier issue had to do with the issue that Kim raised with respect to assessing penalties against, in circumstances where there's been no reporting or there's been more non-reporting for over 5 years of the 10-year base period, by landowners who will show up and say, I didn't know. I'm this innocent landowner. It was leased. I didn't realize they weren't reporting. We heard one variation of it a few meetings ago with somebody who bought a parcel of land that they now want an allocation for, but had never been reported. And how do we evaluate that? Staff needs some guidance if they're considering those sort of requests and how to deal with that. There were no good answers that came out of the executive committee, I'm sorry to say. It did raise one thought, that is any variance request would seem to me to have to come not just from a leaseholder. It would have to come from the owner as well. because we don't want to wind up in a position like this again, where a landowner shows up and says, I didn't know. So we have to make it imperative that they know.
I might be able just to frame the problem. A fellow came in and the parcel had been in his family for generations. He was elderly, his kids were coming into the inheritance, he'd leased it out, and he had no idea pumping was going on. We'd never seen anything on that property, and his heirs were asking for an allocation on the property. I think that's the one that you were referring to, Chair West. Your board heard something about that. I don't know if it was that clear to everybody, but 3 months ago or so.
And there'll be others. We'll hear from the trustee of a trust overseas who's got an interest in a piece of property on which extractions weren't reported. How do we want to deal with that? Thoughts?
I would say on a just case-by-case basis, I mean, 6 years non-reporting is different than 15 years. And I mean, there's,
How is it different? Personally, I don't see the difference.
well, the difference, I would think the penalties for 15 years.
Oh, that may be, that may be different.
Maybe they have a good excuse. I mean, I think you just need,
Okay.
instead of making another chart for 5 years, I'd just go on a case-by-case basis but on something like that, it probably shouldn't go to the advisory committee. It should go directly to the board and let them plead their case.
Understood, but we need to give the staff some guidance, because the staff is going to come to us with the variance and a recommendation. I think we need to give the staff some guidance with respect to the parameters within which we'll consider someone exempt or an innocent landlord for
But
that.
how many could there be that are over 5 years? I mean,
Well, it's a good news, bad news thing. If there are a lot of them, then that raises the sustainable yield. But if there are a lot of them, that's going to create a lot of headaches for us. But
I have two thoughts on that, one is because you own the land, you have certain rights and to water and those things. But because you own the land and you have those rights, you also have responsibilities, and your responsibility is to manage that land, with in accordance with the applicable laws that are out there. And probably the biggest law out there for people pumping is we're all in this together, and if we're not all being honest about what we're pumping, the whole system falls apart. So that's a pretty important thing to stay on top of. And the second thing is just the human nature that the explanations can get increasingly creative, it's beyond the capability of this board to really verify, is that really how it went down, or was there a wink and a nod by somebody, and so you bring in the 88-year-old person that was in Australia to do that. So because it's so serious and because of that, I'm inclined to the direction of staff would be no. You either played by the rules or you have the consequences. That would be my sense for the benefit of all the people who did play by the rules.
what sort of excuses does the assessor's office listen to when you don't pay property taxes? Do they take exceptions? Just a thought. Go ahead.
Your example of the assessor's office, if there's a policy, a matter of written policy, how they handle each case, I think we ought to follow it here. The obligation goes with the property owner. If the property owner leases to another party and the other party does something that is not appropriate, or the responsibility is of the leaseholder, the responsibility and the obligation falls on the guy that owns the property. The people that have been playing by the rules, Supervisor Bennett said it, the guys that are paying the bills shouldn't get a penalty for paying the bills and following the rules. The state of affairs in the world today, if you can get a free ride, you get a free ride. Somebody pays the fare. And that's not what this is about. This is about the water. It's about taking care of everybody and treating everybody the same. I feel strongly for somebody that has not, through ignorance or lack of, truth or information coming from a property owner or a leaseholder, paid the bills, but the responsibility is we can't give them a pass. And I'll use a real plain example. 2 farms, one right next to another. One's growing a crop, the other one isn't. Field's not being used. take the same example. Both farms are using the water, growing a crop. One's paying the bills and one's not. Somebody's getting an unfair advantage. I'm against that.
Any thoughts or ideas, Will? Anyone else?
Well, just as a suggestion, at the risk of my life in this room, I suppose, but I would suggest to you that if they have attorneys managing their property trusts or any, they're not innocent landowners. So that might be one filter your board wanted to consider, right? Just right off the bat, for example.
Well, I guess I wouldn't want to foreclose the possibility that there will be circumstances that will come to staff and staff will bring to the board that might cause the board to conclude that perhaps a penalty is inappropriate or that some allocation is appropriate. But failing that, it seems that the sense of the board is that you know, the landowner should be responsible for compliance just the same way the leaseholder might be, and evaluated accordingly. I think if there are exceptions that need to be heard, we'll hear them. Any thoughts with respect to the variance application fee? It didn't seem unreasonable to the executive committee. I think the $250 is probably an underestimate of what some of these things are going to cost, but we'll see.
So I'd move that we accept all of the recommendations of all of the recommendations in here that come from that work, including the committee. I withdraw that concern about the committee based on that explanation. So I'd move that action.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. We need a roll call?
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Mobley?
Yes.
Director Perello?
Yes.
Director Terry?
Yes.
All right, moving on now to item number 10.
Chair, members of the board, item 10 is a discussion on new stakeholder advisory committees. The need for new stakeholder advisory committees was discussed with your board as part of the post-GSP work plan at last month's board meeting. The new committees are needed to advise board and staff regarding basin optimization, projects, replenishment fees, et cetera. Your board members discussed the need for charters with specific tasks and terms for the committee members, and your board also discussed potentially the need for a conflict of interest reporting, but you tasked your executive committee to consider stakeholder committee formation and come back with recommendations. The executive committee did consider formation of new stakeholder committees at the February 12th meeting. The executive committee recommended that 2 advisory committees be formed, one for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins and one for the Las Posas Valley basins. The stakeholder or the executive committee felt that the number of committee members should be kept to a manageable number, and said that terms perhaps should be 2 years. There were some stakeholder suggestions as well by stakeholders in the audience. One stakeholder suggestion was to have alternate board members chair the committees. Another stakeholder comment was to have the various sectors choose the candidates for board appointment to the committees. So those were some of the things in the discussions. As you heard from an earlier item and from Gina Bartlett, we now have DWR facilitation services on board, and part of that process is, and task is to assist in formation and facilitation of support for those committees including helping develop formal charters. And we had an initial meeting with Gina earlier today, and we came, in our board letter, we have these recommendations. She would recommend that your board hold off on making any specific recommendations at this time and let the facilitation process, the stakeholder interview process, help guide what and inform your board's decision on what stakeholder committees your board should ultimately appoint for advising your board and staff. So this certainly is something that your board can weigh in on, and but I did want to say that's new information or suggestion, recommendation since the preparation of this staff report. So short and sweet.
Thank you. With respect to the discussions at the executive committee, I think as Kim mentioned, we wanted to move forward with essentially GSP implementation planning groups, assigned specific tasks as we discussed some, and those tasks would relate to recommendations concerning basin optimization projects and project funding mechanisms. And that would be, their scope of work, so to develop those ideas and to report them back. With respect to the number of members, we talked about 5, we talked about 7. You get past 7, it gets a little unwieldy. And we did talk about basically where those members would come from. The notion that the different stakeholder representatives, whether it was ag or M&I or mutuals or whomever, would select a representative. We also talked about inviting the Nature Conservancy or a similar group to be a member of the group, which is kind of how we got from 5 to 7. We started expanding membership, and as Kim mentioned, there was a suggestion that to help make the group cohesive, that we, invite one of our alternates on the board to chair each of the respective stakeholder committees, to basically herd the cats during the meeting and then report back what their recommendations are, if and when they come to any recommendations. I don't see the point of waiting. I understand the recommendation, I think, but I don't see the point, because the work that's going to have to take place is going to take some time. Hell, it's going to take a while just to figure out how the committees will be constituted, much less get any work product out of anybody. I don't see the point in waiting to start that process, particularly if we have folks who are willing to step up and volunteer to do some of that work. And I guess maybe that's the next step, once we figure out if and when to go forward, is to sort of invite people who are interested to let us know, rather than have us necessarily, at least my thought was, rather than have us appoint a bunch of people, I'd much sooner have folks who are interested step forward, volunteer, and then we could, hopefully, we have a long list from which to say, these folks could be representative, let's use them. But I don't see the point in delaying that process. Anyone else?
I agree with the idea of two committees, the OPV and the LPV basin. In terms of the number of committee members, I like the fact that you said approximately 5. I think 5 or 7. But I think I like your idea of let people come forward, either as a sector and say, we want to make sure our sector is represented. And once we see that would determine whether we go with 5 or 7, because we'd have more. But don't lock the number down until we see, and it might be different in the LPV versus OPV, in terms of going forward. I'll share the experience we had at the board level, and there was initial pretty strong rejection of having an environmental representative like the Nature Conservancy there. And then that was at the small, this was for the creation of the Fillmore Groundwater Sustainability Agency. But then when the issue came to the board, we actually had quite a few growers saying, it's the dumbest thing in the world for us to not have that because we just open ourselves up and it's much better to have the dialogue. Whether that fits in this situation or not, I don't know, but I think we should leave the door open for somebody, an organization like the Nature Conservancy, a trusted organization by most people on both sides. And what we did in that situation was we let the Nature Conservancy then be the sector representative, and they took applications from people and they made a recommendation to the committee in terms of who that person should be. And that way you had, number one, these people vetted by the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy had their sort of credibility on the line some. And it made everybody feel better. There have been no complaints that have come subsequent to that. So I would include an invitation to the Nature Conservancy for the benefit of everybody in the long run. Better to have everybody at the table rather than having people taking pot shots from the outside. So I support your suggestion. Let's go ahead and get started on the process because it's going to take a while to actually get all of those steps done.
I also support this, but I don't want to limit it to the Nature Conservancy. No disrespect to that group, any environmental group. And then it'll be a picking and choosing of which one, if there is going to be an environmental group. I think I like the concept of 5, but 7 will work. The idea of getting alternates involved, I think, is a good idea. The ability of a committee to do a little more work than the volunteers and the people that are appointed on this committee, the standing committee, could be very helpful for the board in moving forward. I appreciate the comments that have been made. I am interested if there's any other in the public that's got comments on this. That's it.
Could I just mention one thing in terms of clarity? Any environmental organization could apply, but somebody's got to be the coordinator of that. And what we came up with was it was the Nature Conservancy as the coordinator of that sector. And that was because the Nature Conservancy works with these landowners so much that they have a lot of confidence. They have more confidence in the Nature Conservancy than some of these others. I think it'd be much more difficult for this group of 5 people to be trying to pick between the various environmental groups and have this room here with people lobbying and stuff. Let that be something worked out by the sector. And the environmental groups seem to also trust the Nature Conservancy in terms of doing that. So any environmental group can apply, but they would apply through that sector representative that we would designate.
Yeah, I agree with those comments. Doesn't have to be a Nature Conservancy. It could be anybody that applies. Yeah, I think I like your suggestion, Chair West. We should move ahead with the advisory committees. I can easier envision 5 members for Las Posas, but 7 for OPV. It's a bigger group, but and then the suggestion of having alternates be on the committee or even chairing the committee, I think would be the way to go. So.
No, I don't disagree with any of the comments made so far. Certainly, it behooves everybody to have a workable group that is manageable in size, and I think 5 to 7 achieves that.
Thanks. With that, Kim, if you have nothing further, let me open it up to the public. Any questions or comments from the public?
Good afternoon. I'm John Matthews, General Counsel with Pleasant Valley County Water District. I appreciate staff's letter. I think it was concise. I agree with everything that's in there for the most part. I think what I would emphasize today is that, Chair West, you said don't rush it, and I agree with that. I don't see any reason to put this off for some period of time. But I think you have a resource here that you've had buy-in by some of your stakeholders, and that's your facilitator. And I would utilize that facilitator in helping you as much as possible, as pointed out here in the staff report, to develop these various advisory committees that you're coming up with. So I think that's a resource you ought to use. I like the idea of basically asking for volunteers and sifting through and say, why are these people really volunteering? Most people do it out of self-interest, of course. But you all sit up there as policymakers. You're not the mechanics that have to go through all this stuff. I think the decision that Chair West and Director Bennett made on the last item was a good one. You have those exceptional variances, or what Kim says, those are out of the ordinary. You have an advisory committee to get down. I can think of United having a lot of those requests. Pleasant Valley's going to have a lot of those requests. Camarosa may have some of those requests for people saying we were taking water. You guys don't want to deal with that. You don't want to get into the weeds on that. Let some advisory committee do that so that they can grind through it, give you the best facts they have, their best recommendations, but ultimately you are the policymakers and you get to make the final decision. So I'm supportive of this, and I'm supportive in general of advisory committees because that's what SGMA asked for, stakeholder involvement. The only thing I would ask in addition to that is give the advisory committee the latitude and the ability to come back and give you real recommendations, and then look at those closely, because those are the people that have really gotten down in the weeds and looked at it, and you're going to get it for 15, 20 minutes, maybe an hour at best sometimes. They may have dealt with it for a long period of time. So thank you.
And John, just so that it's clear, my recommendation that we move forward was not to the exclusion of other advisory committees on other issues that may.
I understand. I understood that. Yeah.
Just having identified this particular need, prefer to move sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Jürgen Gramko. I have a fundamental question that relates to how these committees would be formed, and that is that we've been grouping Oxnard and Pleasant Valley together throughout this process, and we've carved Las Posas off. But we've created 3 GSPs, and the GMA was created as the management agency for the Fox Canyon Aquifer, which underlies all 3 of these basins. So now we have essentially one basin with the Oxnard area actually having the upper aquifer system as well as the lower aquifer system. The Pleasant Valley and the Las Posas have essentially only the lower aquifer system. But we came up with 3 different GSPs. And for reasons I don't understand, the Oxnard aquifer has the highest cutback. It's a 40% cutback. The other 2 have something on the order of 10 or less percent cutbacks. And we have no interbasin agreements. And so I'm left with the question of, how are we going to manage this? We need to climb up to the altitude and say, all right, are we managing the Fox Canyon Aquifer? Are we managing the Pleasant Valley section of the Fox Canyon Aquifer and the Oxnard section of the Fox Canyon Aquifer and the Las Posas section? And we're going to have committees for each. I really haven't heard how we're going to do this. And because this was originally the Fox Canyon Management Agency, along comes SGMA and creates the Fox Canyon Management Agency, replaces it as the GSA, but the GSA for 3 basins. So you're going to manage 3 basins individually or 3 basins collectively. And I think that decision defines how everything else flows from there. But I've been kind of sitting in the back waiting for some policy. I brought this up in my letter to the GSP comments back in October, and I was kind of hoping that at some point along the way we'd address the question, but we haven't. So, you know, in regard to this item, I would suggest we wait for the facilitator to get some input, but you as a board, I think, probably have some legal advice that tells you how to do this, and I'd like to understand it.
What's your recommendation?
Pardon me?
What's your recommendation on 3 GSPs?
Well, originally, the TAC committee said you ought to manage basin by basin, not basin by basin, aquifer by aquifer. And there was a debate at the TAC level on that, but because the Sigma says managed by DWR Bulletin 118 definitions, it was kind of cast aside and said, well, this is the legislative requirement, but I think managing the aquifers is the practical solution. Because if otherwise, you're going to have interbasin agreements, and that's going to be a whole nother can of worms. I mean, this whole thing is a can of worms one way or another. But I mean, I just haven't reconciled how you take the one Fox Canyon aquifer and you divide it into 3 overlying areas, and then you come up with different safe yields for each of those areas. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it certainly is a real management nightmare.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, Kim, I think, so I guess the question is, this is a receive and provide direction. Have you heard the direction that you need?
I have, Chair.
Thank you. If there's nothing further, then Chair will entertain a motion to approve the executive officer's report.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.